All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to this informational webinar about the Educational Interpreter Grant that PESB is distributing this year. Michael just put the link to the slides in the chat, so feel free to check the slides out. So we'll start with introductions. My name is Mackenzie Dyer, and I am a grant and program specialist here at PESB.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Nguyen, and I am a program manager for educator credentialing, also at the Professional Educator Standards Board. And we're happy to be here to share information about this educational interpreter grants. So we wanted to start off with the land acknowledgements. So as we all gather today, no matter where we're coming from, zooming in from, we just wanted to recognize and acknowledge that we are on traditional lands of Native Americans. Their ancestors were the original inhabitants of this land that we are occupying today. As we proceed with our work, let's make sure that our deliberations and recommendations benefit their descendants equitably. We also wanted to acknowledge the history of this nation, one fraught with contradictions. For too long, this country has elevated a story of democracy and freedom while minimizing the impact of violence and oppression on marginalized communities on whose backs this nation was built. Today, members of our Black and Asian communities and other communities of color continue to experience racism through police brutality, mass incarceration, inequitable education and health services, deportation, and other forms of subjugation. We aim to disrupt the legacy of systemic racism by centering racial equity and justice in our work. This is how we stand with our communities of color. Before we begin, we wanted to offer a moment of silence to consider these words and how you might join us in this work. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We're really glad you've joined us today to talk about the educational interpreter grants that are available. So before we get started, just a couple things about this webinar today. So all participants are muted in this webinar, and there will be time allotted at the end for questions. So please use the chat box for questions, put all your questions there, and we will try to answer them at the end, and if we can throughout the webinar today. This webinar is also being recorded today.
So we did personal introductions, but I wanted to share a little bit about who the Professional Educator Standards Board is. So we are the one agency overseeing two different boards driven by our collective mission, vision, and values. We are an independent agency responsible for overseeing Washington's educator workforce. We're dedicated to ensuring that each and every student learns from well-trained, equity-minded professional educators. So we are guided by the expertise of our two governing boards, the Professional Educator Standards Board, who deal with policymaking related to certificated staff, and the Para-Educator Board. We support this vision through innovative policies that strengthen educator quality, support workforce development, and expand equitable pathways into the profession. And our staff team and board members recognize that high standards for all educators are essential for student success and achievement. A little bit more context. Oftentimes we get mixed up with the other large governing body for education, K-12 education in Washington State, which is OSPI. Although we are not OSPI and we are independent of them, we do work hand in hand with them, particularly with the certification office. In general, you can think about PESB as setting the policy for educator certification, and the OSPI certification office to handle inquiries around individual certificate status and next steps. And so that's, we do work hand in hand with the certification office at OSPI. So this is our agenda for what we're going to be discussing during today's webinar. We're going to start with a little bit of context setting and a little history around the educational interpreter requirements, as well as the how this grant ended up in our budgets. Then we're going to move into more details about the actual grant, the overview of what the grant means and what it can be used for. And then we'll dig into the nitty-gritty at the end with some of the details around what's required for the application. So just a really brief recent history around this grant. So in October 2020, PESB convened a work group for credentialing of educators of the deaf. And after that work group, there was a separate sub-work group several months later that was convened for educational interpreters for the deaf. Based on the recommendations of that work group, in September 2021, the Professional Educator Standards Board approved raising the minimum IPA score to 4.0 from 3.5 for educational interpreters, and that requirement will go into effect starting July 1st, 2023. In the last legislative session earlier this year, the legislature passed Senate Bill 5693, and it provided one-time proviso funding for this grant. And so the intent of the grant we'll talk a little bit more about, but that provides a little bit of context around how we got to this point, a short history of how we got to this point and why this grant exists. Just wanted to reemphasize that this is a one-time funding from the legislature, and so the grant monies will need to be used by the end of June 2023.
So how we are distributing these funds was all laid out in that Senate Bill 5693, which says that the grant, we're offering grants of $2,000 per employee in this role of educational interpreter who is training to meet the new educational interpreter standards. So how this funding will work is that school districts and schools can apply to PESB for up to $2,000 per employee in the role of educational interpreter for professional development. And this aligns with PESB's vision of an equity-minded educator workforce that facilitates learning and growth for each and every student. So the funding really is for employees to become better and more skilled and get some more training in their role of educational interpreter to serve students. So we'll talk a little bit more about what grant activities are allowed in just a minute.
I just put it in the chat, the same link to the document. So everything on this slide deck, which we shared with you, is clickable as well. So you can click right there on that green line, learn more and apply. I also just pasted it in the chat, and that'll provide you a link to the grant manual, which provides additional details. But we'll talk through it on the next few slides here.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Michael. So this grant, the funds are meant to support educational interpreters in training to meet the standards that are listed in RCW 28A 410-271. So you can click on, there's a link in this slide that you can click on to read the actual language. But really it is on the right side of the screen. It lays out the educational interpreter requirements that educational interpreters need to be working towards. So we're working towards a passing score on the IPA written test, and IPA is the Educational Interpreter Performance Assessment. So a passing score on the written test, as well as either an IPA score of 3.5, which is being raised to a 4.0, a score of 4.0, beginning July 1st, 2023. So as that minimum score is being raised soon, grantees can use these funds to train and for testing in order to get that 4.0 score. Or along with the IBA written test, educational interpreters can also do the National Interpreter Certification from the Registry for Interpreters of the Deaf. There's also more information about these minimum requirements for educational interpreters on PESB's website. So you can go to our website and it will lay out all of the information that you need about what the requirements are. Okay, so what the funds may be used for. And this slide, all of the information on this slide is directly from the proviso that was passed by the legislature. So the legislature listed these specific activities that the grant funds can be used for. So the grant funds can be used for professional development, training, or mentoring for educational interpreters. You can use the funds for paid time to attend training and mentoring opportunities, compensation for substitutes to allow educational interpreters to access professional development without interrupting service to students. The funds can be used to pay for courses at institutions of higher education located in Washington that are designed to improve the professional skills of professionals that are meeting the needs of students who are deaf and hard of hearing. And the funds may also be used for assessment fees for initial submission or assessment retakes to meet the minimum standards that we talked about in the last slide, as well as other activities as defined by PESB.
So we are grateful to the Center for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Youth for helping us to compile an initial list of possible activities that would be eligible for grant funding. And so if you click on that link there for the eligible funding list, it'll take you to a document, which this will be a living document, which we will attempt to keep up to date. But these are several pages worth of activities that are eligible for grant funding. Thanks, Mackenzie, for putting that link in the chat. And so if you or others, if you see other activities, please let us know, and we are happy to continue to curate this list. I'm going to share my screen and actually click on this just so you all can see it. We will continue to add to this list, and this is all clickable, but there are several pages worth of different types of mentoring opportunities as well as professional developments, which would be considered eligible for using this grant funding. And we'll continue to add to this list, as I mentioned. All right, so the proviso also lays out who is eligible to apply to for this grant funding. So the way that we are rolling this out is that all of these 5 entities are eligible to apply. So school districts, tribal schools, state-approved private schools, charter schools, and educational service districts can submit an application, and we'll get into the details of the application pretty soon, but essentially it's going to be asking how many educational interpreters do you need funding for, and then we will distribute the funding based on how many based on the need listed in the application.
So in terms of timeline and logistics, the grant application actually opened on September 12th, but we are holding this informational webinar today. But the application isn't due until November 18th. So this grayed out box is our webinar today. to kind of ground us. And then the next activity is that applications will be due November 18th. If there are grant funds, if there are remaining grant funds after the application closes on November 18th, we will reopen the application in an effort to spend the money and get as much professional learning out to interpreters as possible. So after the application closes on November 18th, we will notify applicants of their grantee status on November 23rd. And then the grant period will start November 30th and end on June 30th, 2023. So like Michael said, these are one-time grant funds, and all funds must be spent by June 30th, 2023. So after the grant period starts on November 30th, we'll also hold a virtual kickoff meeting on November 30th to talk about how funds can be spent, how to fill out information in iGrants, and all of that information. Okay, so now we're going to go into the actual application and talk a little bit about the application. So when the application is reviewed, we aren't going to score the applications. We are really looking at the applications for completeness and meeting the requirements that are listed on this slide. So we're looking for fully completed application with all information filled out. We are looking at for an overview of your grant plan with your organization's goals for the grant and how your organization will support the educational interpreters in seeking professional learning to meet the approved performance standards for educational interpreters. And we'll also look for your planned number of participants that your organization is planning to fund or is asking to fund, and how you will identify those participants. So here, go to the next slide. So here are the actual grant application questions, and it's pretty simple. This is just some basic information. One thing to note about the application is that you will apply through a program called Alchemer. So Michael, will you put the link in the slide or in the chat? So you'll apply through Alchemer, which is a separate application system. You'll fill out all this information, and once we will review the applications in November, and then we'll go into iGrants and fill out iGrants information. So until you are notified of your grantee status on November 23rd, all you need to do is fill out this Alchemer application, and then we'll let you know about filling in iGrants information later on after November 23rd. Another thing to note is that since this is an Alchemer application, we suggest that you answer these questions in a Word document and then fill in the Alchemer application, because sometimes it will it'll like kick you out or forget your information, or if you close it too soon, it won't submit. So yeah, we recommend filling it out on a separate document and then pasting it into the application. So the application is pretty quick. There's only, as you can see, there's 9 questions. We had the first general information, and then questions 8 and 9 will be 500 words or less. And this is where you'll provide your grant plan and let us know what's your planned number of participants from your organization that you'll need grant funds for. So when we'll look at these applications, and however many educational interpreters you're requesting to support, we will do our best to provide $2,000 for each interpreter that you are planning to support. All right. If there are any questions,
I see one in the Q&A. Risa is asking, does the interpreter have to be a school district employee or can they be contracted? And the answer is yes. The proviso states that it can be a contracted educational interpreter as well.
so here's our contact information. Please feel free to contact us with any questions or concerns, and we are here to answer questions.
I'm not 100% sure how this webinar thing works, but people are
I-
welcome to raise their hands or they're like on a different
I know
side as
I'm not
attendees.
sure if we can use the chat or if the Q&A is the way to go.
Somebody says chat is disabled.
Oh, no.
Sorry about that. We're learning how to use the webinar feature.
Yeah.
But you're welcome to type into the Q&A if you have any other questions.
Hmm. You want to answer that, Michael? You see that one?
Oh yeah, so the question from Gina is, if I'm a parent educator, do I write the grant or do we ask the school district to write the grants? You're gonna encourage your school district to write it, but if you want to support them in any way in terms of like what you could be using it for, they are welcome to put that information in the grant. It is we tried to make it as easy and low stakes as possible because it's run through iGrants. It will have to be a district that's getting the grant money.
If your district has questions as you go through this grant process, have them reach out to us and we can help support as well.
So we have two questions around the testing requirements for interpreters. Yasmin asks about, has it always been a 3.5? And someone asks about the requirements for testing. So the educational interpreter performance test, I will say that the policy was set before, I think before both Mackenzie and I have worked at the Professional Educator Standards Board, but it has been 3.5 for a long time. And based on if you look at the slide deck history, based on the work groups that met and discussed, it was brought to our board. It was recommended that the requirements move up to a 4.0 starting July 1st. And the board approves that proposal or that recommendation. And so starting July 1st, the requirement will be 4.0. And this proviso grant funding is intended to support educational interpreters in meeting the new requirements. Risa asks another question. Will this information be sent to all districts or do we need to bring it to them? If they are signed up for our Gov delivery as district personnel, we've already sent out information about this grants. You can refer them to our website as well for additional information. But we have been sending it out and we will continue to send it out via Gov delivery, as well as trying to put it on our social media so that districts are aware of the grant funding. And if you need support, I am happy, if you have a contact, I am happy to forward those emails. I'll put our, Mackenzie, if you don't mind putting our emails in the chat box, and then we can support you in contacting your districts. It can be any representative in your district. It can be an HR person. It can be somebody who's in charge of professional learning in order to fill out the application. Linnell, I hope I'm saying your name correct, has a question. Mackenzie, you're typing in the chat to all panelists. Make sure you change it to everyone so that they can see it too. So in terms of required training, data collection, accountability measures attached to grant recipients, I'll leave that for Mackenzie when you're done. You want to take that one?
Yes. Sorry, I didn't realize I was only sending messages to the hosts and panelists. Okay. Which question? Sorry.
Linnell's question around required training, data collection, or
collection.
accountability for grant recipients.
That is a great question. At the end of the grant period, we'll ask you to fill out a quick survey about what trainings you went to. But in terms of accountability measures, no, not really. We'll just ask for an experience survey.
And then Gina asks, who do I contact within district to fill out the application? Gina, you can go ahead and if you need support in finding somebody or you want something more official sounding, go ahead and just email Mackenzie and I, and we are happy to give you information about the grant, and so that they and you can forward it to a district person. Mackenzie, do you want to explain a little bit, because I see Stephanie's question right here about the application around how iGrants works and why it needs to be how it gets state funding gets distributed down to districts.
So there's a system called iGrants, and state agencies and school districts and ESDs use this system to transfer grant funds from state agencies to education agencies. So in order for funds to come from PESB and get to your school, they have to go through this iGrant system. So you can't, if you fill out the Alchemer application for the funds, you will need to let your school building or district know, because once funds are awarded, they will have to log into iGrants in order to receive reimbursement for the funds. So when you do these trainings or professional learning, or however you choose to spend the funds, your school or district will pay for that and then be reimbursed from the state. Is that clear? So you will, yes, to answer the question, you will need to ask your school building or district before you fill it out to make sure that they are okay with getting into the iGrant system and spending funds that way.
And we are happy to support in finding out somebody at your district level who is, somebody should be familiar with that system to be able to access state funding.
Okay, great, Stephanie.
So I'm going to put in the chat one more time the link to the slide deck, but we'll also have, you also have our emails if you have any follow-up questions. We will post this recording of this webinar on our websites, and so you can refer back to it if you have any questions. I know there are several links and several documents that are out there, so hopefully we're able to answer questions for you, but feel free. We are humans. We are trying to be responsive to anyone who has. Our goal is to spend all of this funding. So if you have colleagues and know others, please help spread the word around this grant opportunity. So yeah, feel free to reach out to either or both of us, and we are happy to support you in getting you these funds. So thank you so much for being on today, and have a great afternoon, everybody.